One area of many applications that's often overlooked but very important to familiarize yourself with at least a bit is the preference settings. And in Modo, it's no different. We're going to take a moment now to look at some of the preference settings that you'll commonly use, and also so you can know where some of the other settings are should you need them later on once you start learning more about the application. So if you're on Windows, the preferences can be found under the System menu and then Preferences. If you're on a Mac, it'll be underneath the Modo menu at the far left. And inside of the preferences, we have control over a lot of individual aspects of things that go on inside of the program. Now, a lot of these things you're going to leave alone and you're very rarely going to need to touch. Things like data will give you just a lot of paths and things that are set up by the application install, and very rarely do you need to change. Under defaults, we hit a few more things that we may want to change, and you at least want to know where they are as you get working. So under the animation section, you see you have control over some of your default settings for frames per second and the scene range. So when you open up Modo and you start working on some animation, by default, you're going to have a scene that is 120 frames long and runs at 24 frames per second. So in other words, 5 seconds at 24 frames per second. Now, if you happen to work on things that are shorter, or if you happen to work on things that are 30 frames per second, or if you need 60 frames per second, and you use that very frequently, then you may want to set up your default to be something that would go along with that. Under application, the main thing that you'll want to look at is the undo. So you can see here that we have a max undo level that by default is set at 100. And this typically is going to be enough for most instances. The other thing that it does here is it groups selection commands, which means if you're working in a single tool, for example, these subcommands are recorded separate from the max undo level. So if you happen to be working with the bevel tool and you make a dozen bevels, you can only go back 10. So if this is something that you start to hit up against very often, where you do some work and then you undo, and you get a message that says that you're all out of undos, and if that happens frequently, you may want to come here and increase either your max subcommands or your max undo level, or both a little bit. These do increase your memory footprint a bit, but as long as you have a fair amount of RAM in your system, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Autosave is another important thing to look at here, and this is something that you may want to customize a bit. By default, the time interval, which is how often it automatically saves your file, is set to 15 minutes, and the number of revisions by default is set to 1. So, say I'm working on a scene here, and I've got this untitled scene, let's say I name it My Cool Sphere or something, and I work for 15 minutes and I don't save, it's going to automatically save, My Cool Sphere as an autosave file. All right. Now, if I work for another 15 minutes and don't save, and I make some changes, some geometric changes that might be hard to undo or hard to go back if I need to, it's going to write over my autosave. So then if my computer crashes, I go back, I load my autosave, and it's going to load the last one, and that's all it's going to give me. All right. So what I like to do is set the max number of revisions up to, somewhere between 4 and 6. So if you think about a 15-minute time interval, if you have 4 to 6 revisions saved, that means you're going to have your last 60 to 90 minutes of work automatically saved for you in increments. Now, on top of this, I think it's a very good idea, and I strongly suggest that you get used to saving your files early, saving them often, and also saving them incrementally. So, My Cool Sphere, My Cool Sphere 1, My Cool Sphere 2. That way you have something to go back to should you make some changes, or should you decide that you want a previous version of your model, you'll have that. But by setting up your autosaves in this way, you ensure that you're not going to lose more than a few minutes of work, first of all, with your time interval set to 15 minutes, and that if you're working for a huge amount of time, 60 to 90 minutes without ever thinking to save, that you're also going to be covered and you're not going to override any of your work that you had done. If you made some experimental change right as the computer auto-saved, and then right as your computer crashed, you're not going to be stuck with what was just auto-saved, and that's it. So a couple of things that you may want to check on. However, as your scenes get bigger, you may want to increase the time interval, because sometimes the autosave itself will take a few seconds, and in really big scenes, it might take a few more seconds, and you don't want it to interrupt you too frequently, so you might want to set up the time interval a little bit more, and at that point, it's a good idea to remember to save on your own as well. This is just a backup. All right, so moving on, we're going to skip over a lot of the rest of the things here because they aren't things that you're going to need very frequently. Going down, you'll see that there is options under display here for OpenGL, so let's check that one. And this is going to give us a couple things that you'll want to look at. The texture resolution, and that's just going to be the resolution of textures that are displayed in the viewport. So you can have a texture that's set to 4K or 8K or 16K even, but here in OpenGL, so what you see in the viewport is only going to be displayed at 2048 by 2048. Now, if this is something that is problematic, you may want to come in and increase this. You can set it up to anything. You can go all the way up to 128K. If you have a computer that can handle a bunch of images at 128K, go for it. But just know it's just going to adversely affect your OpenGL performance, and it won't affect how your final renders come out. Flatness of perspective has to do with how your essentially how your camera angle works in your perspective view. So if I take this and I decrease it, you can see that my perspective becomes more and more exaggerated. As I decrease it, it becomes more and more orthographic. So we have something to play with there. The default at 40 is typically pretty good to see your models very well, not distorted, and get a good view of them just while you're working. You can also change cameras in their own camera settings, but this is just for your perspective views in OpenGL. And then the other thing that I think is an important thing to check here is your max polygon count. Now, for most early scenes, this isn't going to be an issue. You can see we have a default setting of 10 million polygons, and that's going to be the actual triangles that are drawn. So if you have subdivision surfaces turned on, this is a sphere that isn't super complex, but it's still, just about 9,000 polygons in OpenGL. So as you get to really heavy scenes, sometimes, especially if you're sculpting, you might get above 10 million polygons. Now, this will only give you a warning and just say, hey, you're about to exceed your polygon limit. Is that okay? And you just can click OK. But if that happens a lot, you may want to come in here and increase this so you have a little bit more polygonal headroom as you're working. Moving down, the next one we'll look at here is RayGL. And RayGL is basically your preview render just inside of any viewport. And this gives you the control over how that is set up so that you can have a little bit more customized version. So the defaults are for the resolution to be half, so your pixels are going to be doubled in the viewport you're looking at. The update mode is delayed, which means you make some edits, and as soon as you finish editing, either moving your perspective or using a tool, as soon as you release that tool or stop adjusting your perspective, it will start to render. Now, a couple of other options you have are lazy, which is in a lot of ways similar to delayed, but it changes the way that the delay happens. And then the other one is synchronous, which will actually try to keep up in real time and render using the preview render as you work. So that one can be a little bit more compute intensive, but if you have large scenes and you want to simply move around, that can actually be an interesting way of doing it because it will automatically continue to adjust, just like if you're working in the preview render. The last thing that we'll look at in displays here before we move on down is the tool handles. And the tool handles, really, you don't have too much to worry about here. You can change the size of the handles in pixels on screen, that kind of thing. And, if they're difficult for you to see or they're too obtrusive, you can come in and change them, increase them or decrease them so that they more suit your needs. But the thing that you should check here, and that I'm going to change because this is at the default at the moment, is the tool handles. And right now they have them set to basic, which is the default. You can set them to invisible, which basically means you won't see tool handles, just like invisible would denote. But the other one is advanced, and the advanced tool handles will give you some additional readouts, which will allow you to get a little bit more precision in your use of tools inside of Modo. So I'm going to set those both to advanced and leave that. Under File I/O, there's some things that you're not going to necessarily need to deal with right off the bat, but you have control over how individual file exporters are going to work, the kind of things that they will include, and the kind of things that you will save as you save out an exported file. So if you're working with other applications, you may need to adjust some things here, but you also have control over these options as you export, so you don't necessarily have to come in and change them right here. Moving down to the last section here is the last place that we'll look. You can see that we have a rendering tab, and the rendering gives you a couple of places that you should check here. The first one is going to be final rendering, which will give you a couple of controls that you should check out. The first one here is the geometry cache, and this is just how much of your RAM can be used when when Modo is actually actively doing a final render. Now I have 32 gigs installed, so it sets it by default at a few gigs below what you have installed. So if you have 16, it will set it to 12. If you have 8, it'll set it to 4. But the intention here is to give you a little bit of headroom with your RAM so that you can do other things while Modo renders, though oftentimes I would discourage that just because it's going to slow your render down, because it's also going to be using your CPU and just making your renders go a bit slower. So you also have some options here for things like the default gamma, which again you can change in the render, so you don't need to necessarily change it here, but it's good to know where these things are. All right, so moving down to the last thing that we'll look at here is the preview render. And the preview render is largely going to be used to set up lighting, work with textures, but sometimes you may want to use it for finished renders because it has some modes that will allow you to get very high quality renders and allow them to render as long as you have time to render, which is a good thing. So one thing that you want to change here, the default for use secondary irradiance cache is set to never. You want to change this down to always. Now, if your preview render starts to really bog down, you may want to change this back to never, but the actual performance hit is fairly small, so you probably won't have to worry about it. I would say set it to always. This is only going to come into effect when you have more than one bounce of your lighting, which we'll look at when we look at lighting here a bit later on. And then everything else here can pretty much stay the same. The only possible option that you may want to check here is the start paused option, which means that as soon as you enter a viewport like the render view that has a preview render embedded in it, it will start off paused. If you turn it off, it will automatically start to render, which sometimes isn't a problem until you get into more dense scenes, at which point this can actually cause the computer to crash as you enter the render viewport because it doesn't have time to organize the viewport before it starts rendering, and then sometimes that can bog your computer down. I like to leave it on the default of start paused, and that way you have control over when it does and does not render. So that's a quick view of the preferences. Now you have a good idea of where a lot of things are that you can go in and change. Should you need them later on, you know where a lot of your controls are for file in and out, for checking your application settings and autosaves and things like that. Knowing where these things are is an important thing as you begin to learn more about working inside of Modo. Well, that does it for this one. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next chapter.